December 14th, 1944. The frozen Dutch city of Zwolle lies under blackout. Every street is silent. Every window is dark. Somewhere beyond the narrow canals and medieval rooftops, nearly 1,000 German soldiers wait behind machine guns, trenches, and barricades, expecting an Allied assault before dawn. Instead, one man walks toward them. He carries a submachine gun, a sack full of grenades, and a mission so dangerous that most commanders would have called it impossible. Before the night is over, the city will be free, not because an army stormed its walls, but because a single Canadian soldier convinced an entire German garrison that one already had. His name was Leo Major. And what happened that night remains one of the most astonishing acts of courage in military history. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War in Western Europe was entering its final brutal chapter. After the liberation of France and Belgium, Allied forces had crossed into the Netherlands, where German resistance stiffened with every passing week. The Dutch people had endured years of occupation. Food had become desperately scarce during what became known as the Hunger Winter. Entire communities survived on little more than sugar beets and soup made from tulip bulbs. German troops still controlled many cities, and every delay meant more suffering for civilians trapped between retreating occupiers and advancing armies. One of those cities was Zwolle, a medieval town of winding streets, brick churches, and centuries-old canals. German engineers had prepared defensive positions throughout the city. Intelligence suggested that close to 1,000 German troops occupied the area. If Canadian forces attacked directly, artillery and street fighting would almost certainly reduce much of Zwolle to rubble, while countless civilians paid the price. The Canadian command wanted better information before launching such an assault. That assignment fell to 2 scouts. One of them was Leo Major. To understand why commanders trusted him with such a mission, you have to understand the man himself. Born in Montreal in 1921, Leo Major grew up during the hardships of the Great Depression. His childhood was far from easy, shaping a fierce independence that would define the rest of his life. When Canada entered the war, Major volunteered for military service. He joined the Régiment de la Chaudière, a French-Canadian infantry regiment that would become one of the spearheads of Canada's campaign across northwest Europe. Almost from the beginning, he displayed an unusual mixture of aggression and composure under fire. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, he landed in Normandy with the first assault waves. During fierce fighting shortly afterward, a phosphorus grenade exploded near him, permanently blinding him in his left eye. Military doctors declared that his combat career was effectively over. Major refused. According to accounts from his fellow soldiers, he simply replied that one good eye was enough to aim a rifle. He returned to the front. Weeks later, he accomplished another feat that bordered on the unbelievable. During fighting in Normandy, Leo Major captured an armored German reconnaissance vehicle almost entirely on his own. The vehicle contained valuable radio equipment and secret code material that proved highly useful to Allied intelligence. For that action, he was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He declined the award. Years later, Major reportedly explained that he refused because he did not wish to receive a decoration approved by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whom he deeply criticized as a commander. Whether admired or controversial, one fact became increasingly clear. Leo Major was unlike anyone else in his unit. By April 1945, Allied armies were pushing deep into the Netherlands. German forces were collapsing in many sectors, yet they remained dangerous. Cornered troops often fought with desperate determination. Canadian commanders wanted to know exactly how strong Zwola's defenses remained before risking an assault. Major volunteered. His reconnaissance partner was Corporal Willie Arsenault, another experienced scout. Their orders were straightforward: slip into the city under cover of darkness. Identify German positions. Return before dawn. Nothing more. The success of the coming battle, and perhaps the survival of hundreds of Dutch civilians, depended on accurate intelligence. As darkness settled over the Dutch countryside on April 13, 1945, the two men crawled toward the city. Every sound mattered: loose stones, rustling grass, the distant clatter of boots. German patrols moved constantly around the outskirts. Searchlights occasionally swept the roads. Somewhere beyond the darkness stood hundreds of nervous defenders, preparing for an Allied attack. The two Canadians advanced silently, avoiding roads whenever possible. Then disaster struck. Near the edge of Zwolle, German fire suddenly erupted. In the confusion, Corporal Willie Arsenault was killed. Leo Major found himself alone. Most soldiers would have withdrawn immediately. The mission had already failed. Instead, Major made a decision that no commander had ordered. He would continue alone. Standing over the body of his friend, Major reportedly vowed that the Germans responsible would pay. What happened next has entered Canadian military legend. Moving through the darkness with astonishing speed, Major began attacking German positions one after another. Whenever he encountered small enemy groups, he opened fire with his Sten submachine gun before disappearing into another street. He threw grenades into defensive positions. He sprinted across intersections before defenders could organize. Again and again, Germans believed they were encountering advance elements of a much larger Allied force. Captured soldiers became another weapon. Major forced several prisoners to escort one another back toward Canadian lines. As each group disappeared into the darkness, those left behind saw comrades vanishing in every direction. Confusion spread. How many Canadians had already entered the city? No one seemed to know. At one point, Major entered a local headquarters occupied by German officers. The sudden burst of automatic fire shattered the illusion of safety inside. Several soldiers fled. Others surrendered. The headquarters itself fell into chaos. Rather than remaining to fight prolonged engagements, Major kept moving. Speed became his greatest ally. He understood something fundamental about warfare. Fear grows faster than facts. Every explosion suggested another platoon. Every burst of gunfire hinted at another company. Every disappearing patrol strengthened the illusion that the Canadian assault had already begun. Meanwhile, civilians hiding inside their homes heard fighting echo through the streets, without understanding what was happening outside. The Germans were trying desperately to identify an enemy that barely existed. Throughout the night, Major encountered isolated patrols, engaged in brief firefights, captured more prisoners, and constantly shifted his position before German commanders could establish a clear picture. Some accounts describe him setting buildings on fire where German positions had been established, creating even greater confusion across the city. Others recount repeated encounters in which bewildered German soldiers, convinced they faced overwhelming numbers, withdrew rather than risk encirclement. Not every detail survives in perfect historical certainty. The broad outcome, however, is beyond dispute. One man systematically convinced an entire garrison that an Allied army had already infiltrated Zwolle. At one point during the night, Major encountered members of the Dutch resistance. Together they shared information about German movements and the safest routes through the city. The resistance had spent years operating under constant threat of arrest, torture, and execution. Now they watched an extraordinary spectacle unfold. Instead of waiting for liberation, liberation itself seemed to be walking through the streets. As dawn approached, the illusion reached its breaking point. German commanders, fearing encirclement by advancing Canadian forces, began abandoning Zwolle altogether. Columns of soldiers withdrew eastward before daylight fully revealed the truth. When Canadian troops finally advanced toward the city, they expected fierce resistance. Instead, they found something remarkable. The streets were largely empty. German forces had fled. Zwolle had been liberated with minimal destruction. Churches still stood. Historic buildings remained intact. Most importantly, countless civilians who might have died during artillery bombardment or urban combat survived. Dutch citizens emerged cautiously from basements and shelters. Soon the caution gave way to celebration. Canadian soldiers entered a city filled not with smoke and ruins, but with grateful civilians, waving flags that had remained hidden throughout the occupation. Some embraced the liberators. Others wept openly. For years they had lived beneath occupation. Now freedom had arrived, and almost unbelievably, much of that freedom could be traced back to the actions of one determined scout who refused to abandon his mission. Leo Major's extraordinary feat earned him the Distinguished Conduct Medal, one of the highest decorations for gallantry available to soldiers of the British Commonwealth. Unlike his earlier recommendation, this time he accepted. Yet Zwolle would not be the end of his remarkable military career. 5 years later, Major volunteered again, this time during the Korean War. There, during the Battle of Hill 355, he led a small group in recapturing a strategically vital position against overwhelming odds. For those actions, he received a second Distinguished Conduct Medal, becoming one of only a handful of Canadian soldiers ever awarded the decoration twice. His courage was not a single extraordinary night. It was a pattern repeated across 2 wars. Despite his achievements, Leo Major never sought celebrity. He lived quietly after military service, largely avoiding the spotlight that often follows legendary soldiers. Meanwhile, the people of Zwolle never forgot. Each year, ceremonies commemorate the liberation of their city. A street now bears his name. Schools teach children about the one-eyed Canadian who saved their hometown. For many residents, Leo Major became more than a decorated soldier. He became part of Zwolle's identity. Historians occasionally debate individual details of that extraordinary night. The precise number of German troops present, the exact sequence of encounters, and the extent to which every withdrawal resulted directly from Major's actions remain subjects of careful study. That is the nature of history. Battlefields rarely produce perfect records, yet the central truth stands on exceptionally firm ground. Leo Major entered Zwolle virtually alone. He remained inside throughout the night. His aggressive actions created widespread confusion. The German garrison withdrew. The city was liberated with remarkably little destruction. These facts are supported by Canadian military records, Dutch accounts, and decades